if you sow, you will reap, and the enemy does bring the reaping of what we've sown. God is merciful and does not want us to suffer what we've sown. So he's always offered a way for us to not actually suffer the consequences by receiving his mercy. But unfortunately, if you're going to use the Bible, I wouldn't personally, because I wouldn't even trust my understanding of it now not to be influenced or tainted by a wrong view or a wrong interpretation. So much better to have a personal relationship with God. Jesus said, my sheep, my followers can hear my voice, therefore let me talk to them. And therefore we have this relational way of outworking the heart of God, not this prescriptive way of our own understanding, because that is what we have in theology. It is the study of God using the Bible from our own understanding. Inherently, that must come from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that's why it's such a mess. When we've encountered God, it will challenge our understanding. It does. If we genuinely encounter God, it will inevitably challenge what we think about him, because we'll realize that what we thought isn't true. And it will change our perspective from the reality of experience. And I know people will say, well, it's all subjective then to your experience. Yes, it's supposed to be, because it's a relationship. It's supposed to be a subjective relational experience. The Bible is actually the stories of people's subjective experiences written down from their perspective, and it isn't all true that they wrote perspective wise. So I wouldn't want to be using the Bible to frame a lot of what I'm doing, because A, I don't think my interpretation would be good enough, but B, I also know that a lot of what's in the Bible actually isn't true from what it says, like people like Job's comforters and all of that, and Job's view of God. It spends 41 chapters, I think, in Job explaining their view of God in a completely wrong way. And then God comes along and says, you don't know anything. At the end of the book, it's like, did you really need to spend 41 chapters telling us your view of God and then realizing that it was rubbish? Not really, but I guess it shows that people's views of God are rubbish based on their own understanding. Hence their friends were, well, you must have done something to deserve God's punishment, because he wouldn't be punishing you unless you did something to deserve it. That was their rationale, because they had a totally wrong view of God and punishment and everything else. So I wouldn't use the Bible in outworking those principles. I would be looking, if God shows me some principles in the Bible, I would go back to him and say, I need revelation from you and your heart to outwork these things today in my life, rather than I'm going to try and use the Bible to frame what I understand about God's laws, statutes, things, because whose version of the Bible are you going to use for a start? And whose interpretation of that version of the Bible are you going to use as the basis? Calvinistic, Arminianistic, they're all in odds with one another as a basic framework. So it's safer to base it on love. If you use love as your plumb line, you can't go that far wrong, because you're never going to do anything which is contradictory to love, which means you're never going to do anything harmful to anybody. Even speaking the truth, if you do it in love, is going to be for building up and helping somebody. If you do it out of vengeance or retribution, then it isn't. And you could still speak the truth, but it won't be in love, because your motive for speaking the truth won't be pure. So better to pursue intimacy and relationship with God and God's heart, and let him frame these things for us in love. And then you use the lens of love if you want to interpret the Old Testament. I personally don't need to interpret anymore. I don't want to try and interpret it. Why am I reading a book about God when I can talk to him every day? So I don't use the Bible like that. It's like, I'm not going to speak to him through a book. He doesn't speak to me through a book. We have a relationship and conversation. So I don't need the Bible to actually frame my life. My relationship with God frames my life. will it contradict the clear principles of the Bible, that God is love, that God is light, God is spirit, God's going to... No. But some people have turned God as the consuming fire to purify and refine into God, the consuming fire, who's going to destroy everything, including the earth and all those people who he doesn't like. Well, actually, that's not what consuming fire is all about. But that's what people have developed into a whole system of belief. So, yeah, I would just ask God to help you every day to frame your life in accordance with the principles that you find in relationship with him, not just the words you find in the Bible or the principles that you have explained to you in the Bible by somebody else. Because that's where most of my knowledge came from, somebody else, you know, whether it be a sermon or a book or even my own study. None of that really represented God as he really is. Now I've met him. You know, so my whole mindset about God deconstructed when I met him face to face. And now I don't believe what the Old Testament says about that God, because it doesn't say it when you really understand the concept of a Jewish book written by Jewish people who didn't know God primarily in that way. And Jesus basically says, I think, I can't remember exactly where it is, but I think it basically says in Luke that no one has seen God at any time, and Jesus has come to explain him, basically, because no one's seen him. And therefore that included all of the Old Testament saints in the way which we now have access to God in that way. And this is where consistencies come along. It's like, oh, okay, so that's what the Bible says. Now, am I going to take that as literally what the Bible means? Or am I going to then take that and try something else? You know, because I know that my understanding of God that came through my interpretation of the Old Testament is clearly totally contradictory to his nature and character and essence as revealed by Jesus and who I have met personally.